Okay, so hopefully it'll warm up a little bit. But our next speaker did exactly what Jan said. She was not a professional writer, but she journaled a lot. And through an experience at the time that her mom was passing away, it was also the time of her midlife shift, and that journaling became more and more and more until Riley Hunter Cooper basically found herself with a book. And it was something that helped her process the loss of her mom. And by the way, Riley talks about that she grew up not wanting to be like her mom. And she'll tell you about that. And she set out to make a very different life for herself. But at the time of her mom's passing, she came to realize just how much they had in common. The dreams and the goals and the struggles that they shared. And so writing this book was mostly for her, but now maybe to help other people with the same process, to really come to appreciate her mom as a person and to appreciate her mom's journey and her journey. So if you'd please welcome Riley Hunter Cooper.
While I was waiting and watching everybody come in, it was so much fun to see the joy and the energy of everybody in here. I've clearly been spending too much time with men in meetings because this was just such a great treat for me to watch. When I was 15 years old, I affirmed to myself that my life would be different than my mother's. I'd be well educated, have a successful career. Money was never going to be an issue for me. And I'd work at something that I loved, which was healthcare administration. I took after my dad in that realm. My sister was a physician, and so we thought between the three of us we would have our own hospital. Well, that was the memory. And much of that was true, just not the lack of struggle at times that I had. Let's have a show of hands here. How many in the audience have a mother? Let's see. Hopefully everybody has their hand up. I'm a little worried about over here, but put your hand back up if you wanted to be different than your mother when you were a young woman. Yeah. It's pretty common, really, and the mother-daughter relationship is a very complicated one. Let me show you a few things that my mom and I shared, and you tell me if you had any of these in your life mapping when you were figuring out what you wanted to do. How about a good dose of a loveless marriage? Okay, let's lose a job. Let's lose it more than once. So most of these were things that my mother and I shared, with the exception of a loss of child. My mother lost her baby boy when he was 52 to suicide. And that was had a dramatic effect on our whole family. But fortunately, for the grace of God, I haven't had to go through that experience, at least yet. This is a picture of us in the 70s. We were pretty cool. I'm the little chick in there with the peace and love dress. But I'm a product of the baby boom generation, the Leave It to Beaver era, where kids ran free. There were no rules. Nobody policed us. Nobody got a trophy. Parents were good if they were doing a head count at night to make sure you were home for dinner. So that was pretty much the era that I grew up in. And life pretty much, if you were Catholic, revolved around the Catholic school and church, which we know now is maybe not such a great idea, but that's what there was at that time. So the women's movement was coming into full bloom. I graduated from college in '79, started working in the early '80s, and maybe some of you remember the perfume Enjoli. I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in a pan, and never let you forget your man. Well, I bought into all of that, hook, line, and sinker. And while I love my mother dearly my whole life, I just didn't want to be her. And I decided after watching her that I was never going to be dependent on a man. I was Ms. Career Woman. In fact, earlier in my life, I was told I'd never be able to have kids. So, I focused on the career. Until they handed me that first baby, and then the second, and then the third, and then my life just did a 180. I mean, I went completely bonkers being a mom. Where some people would get depressed, I got high. I mean, I just loved every minute of it. And really, my kids were all that mattered to me. They were and are still my greatest blessing and the motivation for most of what I've done in my life, because I always had 3 sets of eyes on me. They and my mother were really the ones that helped me through a lot of the challenges that were going to come my way. Didn't know it at the time, but surely they came. And as I started to get a little older, I realized that my mom and I had a lot more in common than I ever realized when I was younger. Let me just tell you a little bit about how the book came to be. Dale mentioned a little bit of it. My mother died on Mother's Day, 2013, on a Sunday. And my daughter was to graduate from undergraduate that same week, the following Saturday, in Pittsburgh. And so we had the funeral on Wednesday because I needed to be in Pennsylvania for the whole week. Day after the funeral, I went out for a 20-mile bike ride in the hills, and I blew my knee out. And I swore, you know, like my mother had horrible knees. I gotta tell you, they were really, really bad. And I swore, I'm like, Mom, darn it, you gave me your knees the day after your funeral because like my right knee was shot. And so I had to have meniscus surgery, and I was down for the count for about 2 weeks. So I started to journal, and I just came back from the funeral, so I'm journaling about my mom and her life, and you know, wanted to honor and validate her life in my writing, but the writing really turned into catharsis for me. It was just mourning her death. And so I'd start writing and oh, I forgot about that. And, you know, so it was good for me just to kind of get it all out. But in that writing, I realized that we had these life parallels that we never noticed, definitely never talked about. And I started to reframe really a lot of what she went through and what I went through a different lens. It was really a learning experience for me. So let me tell you a little bit about my mom. There she is, about 20 years old. She was born, lived, and died, with the exception of 2 years, in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So that was home for me. And she was a great Catholic girl. She did what she was told. She was told by somebody, and I don't remember who, that she had potential. Meaning she was really smart. She could have done a lot of things, but her mother kept her from doing really just about anything. She did what she was told. But she held on to that potential. I mean, that was important to her through her late 80s. So this is my mom and dad, tall, dark, and handsome they are. He was. This was during the war, World War II, and if any of you remember your history, the United States was at war with many places around the globe. Bombs were coming down, and young people really didn't know how long they had to live. So they were doing, you know, the guys were all out in Germany, or in my dad's case, in Hawaii, dealing with the war. The women went to the factories, they kept the economy running. And they never know really, you know, how long they had to live, and a lot of times the relationships that they formed were ones of long-distance letter writing. And my mother and father were no exception to that. Strangely enough, I had a 3-year writing long-distance relationship with my first husband too. The problem with that is you don't really get to know somebody, as my mother found out and I later did as well. So shift happens, right? Things happen that you don't want to have happen, and it's, what are you going to do with it? So a couple of the life experiences that shaped my mother and I, just a word about her family. She came from a very warm German father. I mean, he was a sweetheart. She was the apple of his eye, and I am sure she thought when she married my dad that she was marrying those same character qualities. Isn't that kind of like what we do? If we love our dad, we think we're marrying our dad. If we don't like our dad, we think we're marrying somebody different from our dad, and then we find out they're actually like our dad in some ways. I mean, you just can't win with these men, but this is what she found out, and actually I found out the same thing first time around. So my mother's mother was really very, very, very stern. She was of French descent. I think we have one family picture where she has like a little crook of a smile on her face. But as my sister and I go back in our family history, we realize she was probably clinically depressed. It wasn't diagnosed, but she was clinically depressed. In fact, I just learned this this past summer, that her husband was in a mental institution when the stock market fell in 1929. So for somebody to be institutionalized in 1929, it had to be pretty bad. We never knew this growing up. We have this little depressive streak running through the family. But one thing about my grandmother is she ruled that family. And it turned out on my father's side, his little Irish mother ruled the family as well. And it's a good thing she did. She was married to an Irish laborer who was an alcoholic and thought it was more appropriate to spend the money that he made at the bars on the way home rather than bring it home for her to take care of their 6 children. So she pretty much did everything herself. She bore 6 children. One of them died in early childhood. But they grew up in extreme poverty. Like my father had no health care, no dental care. He lost all of his teeth and had dentures, which I didn't know till he died many years later. But my father witnessed this, and he really viewed that his role was to get a lot of education, make a lot of money. He chose healthcare administration, and he saw himself as the provider, which men, you know, historically have seen themselves more so than maybe today. They're a little more balanced, I think, now. But as I was writing, I realized that I came from a matriarchal family. I had 2 strong grandmothers. I had a very strong mother when I tell you her story. My sister and I don't get kicked around too much, and all of our girls are pretty tough. And so I was kind of like, oh, I guess that's kind of who we are. I didn't know that, but it sort of came out in the book. So one of the shared experiences that my mom and I had was divorce. And I called it divorce duplicity. We both lost that love and feeling being married to tall, dark, handsome, intelligent, but usually absent physically as well as emotionally. My ex was often gone anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months overseas. When my kids were little, I was working full time, and it was like, good luck with all that. Before the divorce, mine and my mom's, we both had a period of what I call living in exile. My mother was transported from the city of Pittsburgh, where she had her family and friends and activities, out to suburban, it wasn't suburban, it was rural tract housing in the far suburbs of western Pennsylvania. Guys were coming home from the war, and they had GI Bills, and they were, building these little homes out in the suburbs, which, was pretty common in those days. The problem with my mother is she had 4 little kids, no car, and there was only one other house in the neighborhood. So, she was obviously very lonely. My dad worked full time during the day, went to school for 7 years at night. So she was, pretty much on her own. Me, after working in healthcare for about 10 years, agreed and actually thought it was a good idea to move to rural Germany with my now ex-husband, who was working on his postdoc in high energy physics. I took an 8-week-old baby, a 3-year-old little boy, and a 6-year-old little girl who would go to 1st and 2nd grade in totally German schools. I'd get a note home from the school, and it would take me like 2 hours to figure out what in the world they were trying to tell me. And after about 3 months of this, I said, fine, you figure out what they're saying, you figure out how to communicate, because learning German after having a 3rd baby or any language wasn't really something I was into doing. I mean, I had 3 kids, and I learned a bit to get by, but it was never good enough. So in doing that move, I gave up my job, which I expected. I got to be home with my children for 2 years, which had never happened before. I gave up my church, my family, my friends. I had no support system over there, and if I wanted to speak to anybody, it had to be in German. Yeah, it was great. But because we were I was so isolated, it was always dark and rainy, and I really didn't have any support from my husband at the time. I was probably clinically depressed. I didn't know it at the time. I mean, again, that streak that nobody talked about. It's like, oh yeah, that's what was wrong with you. But it was one time in my life where I actually needed somebody to help me, and there was nobody there to do it. Except my children were the reason I got out of bed in the morning. They were the only reason I got out of bed in the morning. They say of expats, those that come back from living overseas back to the United States, that you usually do one of 2 things. Either get a divorce, or build a bigger house, or buy a bigger house. And I was a super achiever at that time, so I did both. I came back, first the divorce and then the bigger house, but I did what I called a mid-course correction after 16 years. My mother divorced after 22 years. She did that in 1967. And if you think about 1967, if you were around then in a Catholic church, that was unheard of. I mean, she was a trailblazer. I didn't know it at the time, but she was one tough cookie. So Mom was out of work for 22 years, which is tough going back to work. I mean, the women's movement was going on, other women were more educated, they worked faster, they were younger, and we both went through this when I went back to work at one point. If any of you have not seen the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie, I urge you to see it, regardless of your politics. It really takes you back to realize how bad things were at that time. My poor mother had no money to her own name prior to working at this job. Excuse me. If you had credit cards in those days, it was always in your husband's name. And so my dad didn't make it easier on her. He, stood her up in court many, many times to delay, cut up all the credit cards so she could not take advantage of the luxuries that she did in the past, such as getting us socks and underwear to go back to school. So she was pretty broke. And when I think about it, when I got divorced, I had the support of my mother, my family, my church, and friends, and even that was a pretty tough going. I got food from a food pantry when I was getting divorced. I mean, this is after I'd been working professionally for quite a number of years, so I was down to getting food from the food pantry. Fortunately, it's a place that I contributed to in the past. I was court-ordered to pay a third of family bills, even though it was based on income I made the previous year in a part-time consulting role. And so I didn't have a job at that time, but I had to pay the bills. I had no job at that time. I was out 2 years. I was cold. And so I was depressed beyond words because it wasn't coming together for me. Stuck in the divorce, no job, 3 little kids. And I decided at that time that I was going to soar. And I was going to make sure that my children did as well. And that was my promise to myself. And they took their cues from me. So I projected only an adventure with this divorce. We're getting a new house, you're getting your own room, you get some new furniture. Guess what? You get to go to the same school, but you're going to get clothes from Main Street rather than Kmart now because, Mom soon was making money. So it was an adventure. They didn't miss what they never had. They didn't have that close of a relationship with their dad because he was always gone. But fortunately, after the divorce, he became a really, really good dad, and I'm really blessed that he's continued to be that person for them. For my mom, her own mother didn't support her divorce. The church wanted to excommunicate her. She had a very low-paying job, and I think back that she was very, very brave. She didn't talk about it. She had nobody to help her. Frankly, I don't know how she made it through. And while I swore, my mom, she divorced when I was 10, and while I swore that I was never going to get divorced because I was a Christian, I knew what the Bible said, I read all the books about how to make your marriage work if you're the only one trying, it didn't work. And I ended up getting divorced as well when my oldest daughter was 10. Again, something I vowed I'd never do. Let me slip to, I love this picture of my mom. She's 56 here. There was one benefit of divorce. It is some time to yourself, and in my case, it was dating. And it's pretty heady to get some male attention after being ignored for so long. And this was my mom out having a beer with a couple guys. She dated a lot. I mean, she loved to dance. She wasn't immoral or anything, but she just loved to have fun. And she danced, and she met people, but even into her mid-80s, she had guys chasing her, which I think is hilarious at the retirement community. Because retirement communities are often like junior high. They're pretty much just like it. But she never really wanted to settle down with anybody. They didn't meet her standards, and frankly, she didn't want to take care of anybody. I mean, she'd already done that. Been there, done that, and she was done. For me, I had 3 little kids watching everything I was doing, and they were little at the time. So for me, dating was much more infrequent. In fact, it was infrequent until I met the man I was going to marry. I dated him for 2 weeks before we decided to get married. We decided to get married 6 months later, and that was 23 years ago. So we became the Brady Bunch +1, 7 kids. But oops. Did I just turn you? Oh, here we are. Thought I lost you for a minute. About 6-7 years into our marriage, we had a small business. And if you went through the recession in 2008 and you were self-employed, this was not a recession. This was a depression with a capital D. I mean, the bottom of our business totally fell out. I had 2 in college at the time. one a high school senior girl, so prom, hair, makeup, college applications. I mean, all these things were just more than I could handle at the time. And my daughter, unfortunately, saw her previously very fierce mother fall apart, emotionally and physically. And I don't have a lot of regrets in my parenting with my kids, but that was one regret that I did have, is that I couldn't shield her from the pain that I was going through. I remember once when she was younger, she screamed at me, "I never want to be like you. I'm going to get a lot of money and have a really good job." And I just remember chuckling to myself. I was like, "Gotcha, sweetheart." I remember thinking that when I was 15 as well. But while I was mentally dealing with all the change that we had, and it was tough, I went from head to toe in pain. I never knew that stress could do that to you, but I mean, it was literally head to toe. Every part of me hurt, and I had to get a lot of medical care at the time. But besides my children and my mother, my church was a big help to me at this time. I had somebody come to our door once and said, "You know what, we're going to pay your mortgage this month." Somebody else left a $4,000 donation at the church in my name. Thought you might need this. I did all kind of odd jobs like landscaping, home decorating, picking out furniture, kitchen organization for my ex-husband's divorce attorney. Think about this. This was a person like 10 years before that wanted to ruin my life. We became friends and she wanted me to do some stuff for her. I mean, I think God has a great sense of humor when you think about it. But my job search at that time took a long time. I was out 8 years. Recruiters told me I was cold, which was like, what are you talking about? But I had to start over again. And I had to start in positions that I had not held before, lower level positions, to work my way back up to where I was before. It was once so bad that I dug a tree out of my garden and took it back to Home Depot so that I could get $125 to pay a bill that was due. It was great. But once again, my mother was the one to help me. She helped me financially. She helped me just by listening. I mean, she hadn't gone through a lot of the stuff that I did in terms of the workforce, but she was a great listener, and we had a lot of fun talking and laughing about how bleak everything really was. I mean, it was so bleak that when we would visit, went to many attorneys, my husband and I, and financial people, and they all pretty much said the same thing. "Riley, you need to divorce him, and then you need to declare bankruptcy." And I'm kind of like, no, we're not going to go there. That's just not going to happen. My husband and I, second husband now, knew we were stronger tethered together than alone, and we had really pretty good communication skills with each other. And while we went through a hard time, we loved each other, and we banded together. And if you've ever been through a really rotten experience with your spouse, you know, sometimes afterward you are forever tethered, and it makes you stronger. So the funny thing about this is I was going to light the world on fire. Remember, I was that Miss Career person when I was younger, and here I had my mother in her 80s helping me as a full-grown adult. It was totally humiliating, but I learned to get over it because I had to do it. She was always by my side and always believed in me. And from her, I learned to appreciate the simple and the sublime, much like you were speaking about earlier. I notice how the sun hits the earth at just a certain angle. I notice the birds singing. Blessings for me at that time, and still today, if I'm going downtown on the train stops right in front of me and I get on first so I can get a window seat. That's a great day, because there weren't a lot of good things going on then. So I had to really dig deep to figure out what they were. And when you reframe those kind of situations, you begin to see really just how blessed you truly are. Let me go and see if I've skipped you any. Oh, this is right on track here. So here's my mom and I. Her health started to fail in her mid-80s, and she had 2 serious bowel obstructions 5 years apart. And so it was touch and go for a while, but I got to see this beautiful, vibrant woman just reduced to a little old lady of skin and bones. So frail and translucent. Her skin is, it was like paper. I have a little bracelet on that she always wore, and I still wear it, that little one on her little purple her wrist. But this was a pretty tough time. I was out here in Chicago working, traveling back to Pennsylvania so that I could be with her, and I was blessed that I could spend the last 2 weeks of her life together with her. And we went from hospital to rehab facility to hospice. And I gotta tell you, being in healthcare for 40 years, seeing an elderly person in the hospital is really rough. I mean, there's a lot of good doctors and nurses, technicians there, but when you go to the hospital, there's tests, there's procedures, they all hurt, they all cost something. And usually in older ages, they don't change the outcome. In fact, it's estimated that the last 6 months of a person's life are usually their most expensive of their whole life. So this is where my parent became the child. I became the parent. She was then my little baby to care for, changing diapers, feeding her, number of other activities that I really, truly felt honored to do for her. She did those same things for me. And we were very close. I became fiercely protective of her dignity. Anybody snide comment anywhere, it wasn't going to happen when I was around. I mean, I've been in healthcare, so I kind of knew the scenarios. But we went through this sacred process called death. And I have to say, it's truly spiritual. And as you mentioned, it is alone, but my brother and I were with her when she counted her final breaths. And it's just something that it's a circle of life. And, and I've told this to my kids, it's like everybody's going to die. It's a question of what you do before then and how you die. And that's what matters. But as I mentioned, she died on Mother's Day, and her funeral and the gathering afterwards was a big party, a big Irish party, right? We told stories, there were skits, and we had a lot of full closure. But nonetheless, I had regrets. My mother never shared her private moments or thoughts with me. We never cried together, and trust me, I am quite skilled at crying. She never would. She held friendships at bay, and there were a lot of experiences that would have given her joy in life that she bypassed for her own reasons, I don't know. But isn't it just like a daughter? We always want to remake our mother how we think they should be. My girls are doing that to me now. I just love it, because at least I understand it. But I'd like to read just a short snippet from the end of my book. So many times, as I reflect back over the years, I now realize that I am my mother in so many ways. I was just too busy becoming me to ever notice. I mourn my mom, but I also seem to be mourning my own life, struggles, disappointments, and dreams. And yet, despite my age, I still think the best is yet to come. Yet who loves more than a mother? There is no one who could. You were always there, Mom, whether I wanted you or not. And now you're not. So this is my story, and it's really just one story. We all have a story to unearth, I'm sure you do. And in my book, I have what I call reflection pages that take the reader through their own life journey at each chapter. So, it's used in book clubs to, talk about, or individually, just to kind of process what your legacy was, what your relationship was with your family. Most of what I shared in the book, people don't talk about at all. They just suffer. And again, through the grace of God, family, and my special mother, a lot of those things were not the ending of my life, but really something to help me grow, something to help me become resilient, and in the process, just become a stronger person. And a lot of times I said, okay, God, I am strong enough. I don't need anything more. But, what choice do you have, right? It's how you respond to things. So we all have a story that shapes us, and I encourage all of you to process your own story. Thanks.
Thank you. I was struck by the hidden gift of the injury that kind of grounded you and really gave you the opportunity to kind of reflect on that stuff. Sometimes, we have to embrace those things. So
I did get the deck painted though too. That was. I'm like, why am I home for 2 weeks? It was kind of dumb, but I did enjoy the time.
Yeah, what a lovely tribute, and a testament to the power of reframing, of taking the time to write it down and really make sense of it all. So, anybody have any questions for Riley?
Reward them.
Yeah. I don't, maybe so this, what's the name of your book?
It's called
Maybe.
Reflections in the Mirror.
Oh, in the very, the
The
first
mother-
one, I'm
the
sorry.
mother-daughter
Okay,
dance.
Yeah, and so it's a book and a workbook, it sounds like? or
It's
something?
it's a nonfiction, but it has reflection pages so that,
Oh, excellent.
yeah, so that you can write. Because after I did it, I'm like, so what? It's one story, but you know, like I said, everybody has one.
So how did you get published then, like talking about all this?
Oh gosh, that was just such a fun thing. I had published a lot professionally, had done research and published articles and book chapters and that kind of thing, but this was the first time to do something in the nonfiction realm. And originally, I went out to publishers, and I learned very quickly that writing the book is the easy part. Getting it published was like, I learned a lot, let's put it that way. Having it edited was another thing that I wanted it to be juried. I wanted someone to take that and rip it apart and have me rewrite it, and you know, that didn't happen unless I did it. I rewrote it several times. So the publishing part was probably the hardest. And then there's a whole promotion piece, which is supposedly harder than that, so. Sure, want me to fade?
No, we're good.
Okay.
We're good. Anyone else for Riley Christian?
How long did it take you to write it, and did you work on it consistently? And you said you rewrote it. How many
I
times did you
probably
rewrite it?
rewrote it 2 or 3 times. I think writing was maybe 3.5 years. Editing was a year. I was just very unhappy with the editing that my publisher gave me. I was chewing them out every day. I mean, it was just ridiculous. That's why I said I wish you would have been my editor. So in all, it took about 5 years. And I did it at night. I mean, I was working full time. My husband does tax, so during tax season, he's working on it all the time at night and on the weekends, so that's when I did it. Only when the weather was bad. It was nice I was outside. But.
Good for you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.